Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Jason Bristol. I am the chair of the New Leaders section of the club, which is the under 40 division of the club, and I am also a member of the board of directors. I am very pleased to be able to introduce today's speaker, Robert Mickens. Mr. Mickens is the Vatican correspondent for the Tablet, a revered international Catholic weekly that has been published from London since 1840. Robert Mickens' beat covers one of the world's oldest human institutions with spiritual and political influence over more than 1 billion followers. Born in neighboring Toledo, Ohio, Mickens has been covering the Vatican for more than 2 decades, including the Vatican Radio, the BBC, and of course his work at the Tablet. While church attendance continues to fall in many Western countries, the influence and workings of the Vatican continue to draw close attention, and it is Mickens who shines light on the inner workings of the Vatican in our ever-changing, fast-paced religious and political climate. Mr. Mickens?
Thank you very much. I hope that I can live up to that nice introduction. A revered paper. The Tablet is, as a matter of fact, a revered publication, and I've been working for it since the year 2000. I took a little break and then came back in that very momentous year, 2005, when Pope John Paul II had that dramatic decline and died, and then we had the conclave and the papal election that put Joseph Ratzinger on the throne of St. Peter as Benedict XVI. And since then, I've been covering the Vatican as the Tablet correspondent. First, a few things. I want to thank you all for coming and this honor to be able to speak to you. I hope that I'm not condescending in any of my remarks. Sometimes it's difficult to know exactly what the level of knowledge of the Vatican is because, as was said at the beginning here, it is an ancient institution and it has many, many layers of activity, intrigue, and sometimes there's a lot of stereotype that's thrown about in the media by my colleagues who are not so well versed on the institution. I also think I need to say right away that I am a Catholic, and I'm a lifelong Catholic. That's not to say that, however, that I'm an apologist for the Roman Catholic Church or its hierarchy. I love my church, and I love my church as I love my family. But there are certainly things about my church and my family that I'm not terribly proud of or that I could never defend in public. And so I just want to say that what I tell you today is from a love of my church. I'm not embarrassed to say that. However, there are some things that may sound critical. They are not meant as an attack on the Catholic Church or its hierarchy. Secondly, I also must say that my thoughts today that I share with you are not necessarily reflective of the views of the Tablet or its editor. I need to say that to protect my job. I was brought up as a Catholic, as it was said, just round the shore of our beautiful Lake Erie in East Toledo, and I come from a long line of Catholics. My grandmother, who's on my dad's side, is 92 now. She's born of Hungarian immigrants, and there are a lot of Hungarians here in Cleveland as well. So grew up in a kind of a Catholic enclave. My mom's mother was part of that group of German Catholics that came to Ohio back in the 1800s. And so there's long Catholic tradition on that side of the family as well. And ironically, both my grandfathers were what they called converts to the faith, and that's probably what made my grandmothers so devout as Catholics, because they had convert husbands. I don't know if it was said at the beginning, but I studied philosophy and theology, and so you probably deduced that I was a seminarian, and that's how I got to Rome in 1986. I come from right inside the bosom of the church, as it were. I was studying for the Diocese of Toledo. I studied at the Gregorian University in Rome, run by the Jesuits. And after I left the seminary, I got a job at Vatican Radio. And while I was there for 11 years, I got to know many of the people who work inside the Vatican. I became somewhat an insider, a member of the family of the Vatican, as it were. And I traveled a lot with Pope John Paul II on his travels abroad. So I really got inside the inner workings of the system. And when I left to work for the tablet, John Allen, who you might know quite well, would say, "Bob Mickens comes right from the belly of the beast." So much for me. I've chosen to speak to you today about what I've begun to call for several years now, the Vatican implosion. Now, implosion, what do I mean by implosion? Well, I define it as the collapse of an entire system, a structure, an ethos, a culture, if you will, of global church governance. It's the crumbling of what is as close to an absolute monarchy as anything that ever existed in the world, certainly in the Western world. In fact, the Catholic hierarchy, and certainly its center in Rome, could arguably be called the last absolute monarchy in the West today. It is imploding, I think, for a variety of reasons, which I hope not too glibly I'll be able to explain to you in a few moments as we go on. Now, obviously, this implosion hasn't just begun, and it's not yet been completed, at least not fully. But there have been warning signs, and they've been popping up inconveniently, embarrassingly, shamefully, and more frequently. Most recently, at least in Rome and the beat that I cover, we've been hearing a lot about, and we've been reporting a lot about, something that's been dubbed the VatiLeaks scandal. Now, this is a saga that's been dragging on for over a year, and it's deeply embarrassed Pope Benedict XVI and his top aides, especially one man, his Cardinal Secretary of State, Tarcisio Bertone, a 78-year-old Salesian. If you haven't been following this saga up till now, let me just kind of describe it in a nutshell. The Pope's former butler, an Italian layman who's 46 years old and is married and has 3 kids, is currently in a jail inside Vatican City. Vatican City, as you may know, is about the size of an 18-hole golf course with beautiful gardens and lots of Renaissance buildings and palaces and the Vatican museums, of course. They've also got it's a full city. It's like a little village. They've got a police department, a fire department, post office. They mint their own coins, euro coins, most of which they sell for collector's items. And they have a little jail in there that they set up. And that's where Paolo Gabriele is. He was just convicted last month, sentenced to 3 years, reduced to 18 months. And he's there for stealing the Pope's private papers right out of his residence, where he worked as his kind of valet or valet, and he leaked them to an Italian journalist. This writer published a few dozen of those papers in a book last May, which has gone on to become a bestseller, you can imagine. These letters paint an unflattering portrait of the Vatican, suggesting that it's a place where cardinals and bishops bitterly fight for higher posts, are engaged in financial corruption, cronyism, and things far removed from simply knowing how to say their prayers in Latin. And Latin, by the way, is making a comeback, if you haven't heard about that, as well as all sorts of other ecclesiastical fashions, fixations, and other things that come from an age that predate the Second Vatican Council, which happened between 1962 and 1965. I'm going to get back to that in a moment because it's a watershed. The Council was a watershed moment in the life of the Catholic Church, and I believe that it's a key to understanding this thing that I call the implosion. But for now, let's go back to these warning signs of the implosion. Here in Cleveland, of course, and in places like Boston and my hometown of Toledo, another painful and poignant sign of the imploding church, at least for many Catholics, is the widespread closing of parishes. no matter how you dissect this phenomenon, there's really no upside to it. On the one hand, it's an indication that we're losing people. We're losing people. It's more than just simply people are moving into other areas. That's happened, but we are losing people, and the surveys, the Pew surveys show that former Catholics now make up the second largest domination of Christians in the United States. That's a problem. I think it's a problem. On the other hand, we also have far too few priests. Let me just say immediately that the priest shortage, which is way beyond crisis point, this is no longer just a crisis, it's beyond that. This is another key element, I believe, in understanding this Vatican Catholic Church implosion. If Cleveland or Boston or Toledo or any place in the world for that matter had a plethora of young priests, not a single parish would be closed. I guarantee you. We would keep a parish open for 3 people because that's what we do. We don't like to close our buildings. But the fact of the matter is we don't have enough priests. And this is despite the greater emphasis on lay involvement that emerged from Vatican II. The Catholic Church is juridically and structurally a priest, or I would say a clerical-centric organization. That's really unfortunate, but that's the fact. Structurally, the Church revolves around the clerics, and that's why we're closing parishes. We don't have enough of them, and we've not found a way to open up ministry to other people besides celibate men, all celibates. It becomes, this kind of clerical-centric organization becomes ugly and grotesque when, at its worst, this clerical centrism becomes clericalism. And clericalism, that is the idea and ethos of a priestly class or caste system separated or raised above the rest of the body of believers, the baptized members of the household of faith. This clericalism is not only another warning sign, I think, of this impending implosion, but I would go so far to say it's a cancer in the church. Clericalism is a cancer in the church and has no place in the body of Christian belief. Its resurgence in far too many of our newer bishops and our younger clergy is a cause of worry. It is for me, and I think it is for many others as well. Just think of the methods that have been employed in closing our parishes. They also show telltale signs of this implosion. A bishop, by his own will and fiat, as long as he assiduously follows every little iota of canon law, can shut, close, transfer, or merge worshiping and serving communities pretty much at will. And if there is something terribly wrong here, I think, when the long drawn-out struggle continues to open up parishes that bishops forcibly close. And the only reason that has happened is because they get a bishop on a technicality. Catholics here heard the good news recently when the Vatican got Bishop Lennon on technicalities and overturned some of his closing. But I guarantee you, this is not the last that you're going to hear of forced mergers and closures. Unless there's a miraculous, sudden, and massive increase in the number of priests, the U.S. bishops will continue to downsize the number of our parishes. Bishops in Europe have already begun to do so as well. Again, this is because the structure of the church is predominantly clerical-centric. Obviously, if the sacraments are central to the life of a Catholic, principally the Eucharist, and now penance and reconciliation, there's a move to get Catholics back to this sacrament. But if these are central, it's only the ordained priest who can administer them. And so a shortage of priests will greatly cripple the church unless we open up the priesthood to other people besides celibate men. Catholic bishops all over the world and the popes in Rome have been warned for decades that we need more priests. Calls for married clergy have been consistently and firmly rebuffed by the Vatican. And women clergy, well, Catholics aren't even allowed to discuss that. There's no discussion. If you're a church employee and you do discuss it, you risk being fired. This all-male, non-married priesthood just helps keep the clericalism and the clericalist ethos intact. Now just think of the clergy sex abuse scandal, the crisis. It's another major sign in our times of the slow and ongoing implosion. And I agree with those experts who say this form of abuse is not so much about sex as it is about power and control over one's victim. The clericalist environment allowed the scandal to reach the proportions and cover-up that it did. That's without a doubt. And by the way, it's not over yet, folks. I hate to say it. We thought we'd turned the corner, but not by a long shot. The Australian government just this week opened a thorough inquiry into sexual abuse in their country, much in the same way that the Irish government did a couple of years ago. And this has just caused all kinds of havoc in one of the world's most Catholic countries, Ireland. People are walking away from the church. The signs of the impending implosion have never been clearer than in the way our bishops in various parts of the world have so inadequately handled this crisis. It was once thought, at least by the Europeans who run the Vatican, and by the way, most of them are Italians, it was once thought that the priest-sex abuse issue was an American or at least an Anglo-Saxon problem. Well, that's been proven absolutely false. There was a major international symposium at the Gregorian University in Rome last February that proved it was false. They had bishops and members of the clergy from all parts of the world, almost every country. The Vatican, at least a number of people in the Vatican, lent its support to it. Pope Benedict XVI himself supported the symposium, but they could not hold it at the Vatican because of opposition within the Roman Curia. There are still men in the Roman Curia who believe that this is an issue that needs not to be talked about. The Vatican is still struggling to enforce worldwide norms. These are new norms that have come up in the last few years on the way that bishops are to deal with accusations of abuse. The Pope, unfortunately, has been very ambivalent on the issue. On the one hand, he's condemned abuse and forcefully. He's worked more urgently in the past few years to remove abusers from the priesthood. But, on the other hand, he's not done anything to discipline bishops who covered up or ignored the abuse, clergy sex abuse. He's not held them accountable. And I should note that in the Italian language, there is no word for accountability. Responsabilità, responsibility, but not accountability. That nuance, it doesn't exist in Italian. And to understand the Vatican, you have to understand that it is very largely influenced by Italian culture and thought. To hold these bishops to accountability, or to hold them accountable, would require structural changes, not major ones, but changes in the structure nonetheless. And this Pope, as his predecessors, is not willing to entertain any significant changes in the existing structures of church governance. I believe that the refusal to do so is not only a symptom of the Vatican's implosion, but its root cause. Now, when exactly did this begin, all this thing that I'm calling the implosion? When did the implosion begin? Well, you probably figured it out by now. It didn't begin just recently. It didn't begin with the election of Pope Benedict XVI, although, I have to say, I think he's done things that one could argue that things that you could say at times have maybe accelerated the implosion. He's also, very interestingly, deliberately resisted doing things that would help at least mask the seriousness of the implosion. He's allowed this to unfold. That is one thing that's very interesting about Pope Benedict. John Paul II, on the other hand, and the people that worked with him, did everything to deny the implosion. It was well underway in his pontificate. Despite centuries-long papal rhetoric, the hierarchical church as we know it was not willed, I don't believe, or designed, I don't believe, by Jesus Christ, not the structure we have. Neither was it explicitly designed by St. Paul. whose letters form as much of the core of our Christian doctrine as the Gospels themselves. So, just from the outset, let's make it really clear. I'm not putting this on Pope Benedict. This did not start with him. I'm not a historian, but I have read the scriptures, and I've studied a little bit of history along with my theology, and I can't find any arguments in the New Testament to support the monarchical rule of bishops, not even the Bishop of Rome. If anything, if you read the Acts of the Apostles, our early Christian community looks more like a commune, and we see elements there that we would rightly identify in our own age as democratic or pertaining to democracy. And yet our church leaders, including the Pope, they will admit none of that in the church. They love democracy. They do, and that is today. Their love affair with democracy is a rather new thing, but if you read the Pope's speeches on civil governance from the past 5 decades, you'll find that all the popes have very strenuously encouraged the development of democracy around the world as a way toward peace and development, but not inside the Catholic Church. Ironically, democracy is a dirty word when applied to the church. And that's a problem because we live in a democratic world and we have democratic thought processes and we're all democratic people in a sense. I mean, the people that work at the Vatican all come from democratic societies. They don't come from absolute monarchies. They don't exist anymore. Up until a few hundred years ago or so, when absolute monarchies still existed in the West, when they had not yet been all overthrown, Catholic hierarchies and hierarchs had a much easier time denying any introduction of democratic processes into the life and governance of the church. But these monarchies are no more, at least in the West, save one, the papacy of the Roman Catholic Church. Even the Orthodox churches allow laymen to participate in the election of their bishops and in decision-making. I'm going to say something that's not very popular, at least not where I live, in Rome, but I believe that ultimately the church's implosion is tied to its anachronistic structure. Put simply, a church that functions as an absolute monarchy in a world where such are almost entirely obsolete is just that, an anachronism. Most of our Catholics and most of the men that rule at the Vatican or in our dioceses are people who have grown up in democratic societies. But then they're expected to live without any contradiction or schizophrenia their life of faith in a monarchical or feudal system. Faith life thus becomes something that is outside our normal human experience. At the risk of making a mistake, and Father Cousins can correct me since he's a theologian, I'll say this in a bit of theological terminology. The church is no longer an incarnate reality. Catholics believe strongly in incarnate faith. That is, the belief that God comes and dwells among us, in our world and in our experiences. God, we believe as Catholics, is near to us. He's not somewhere far removed. And yet, the entire ethos of the institutional church, well after the end of the Ancien Regime and well after democracies swept away the absolute monarchies, our church continues to be rooted in this obsolete structure. The crisis and implosion comes from the realization that this system is anachronistic and must be reformed. And this brings me very briefly to the Second Vatican Council. The Council made the attempt to make peace with not only modernity, not only contemporary world, but modernity, the Enlightenment. And we moved forward after the Council, but it seems at some point we moved back, and we're moving back. We're moving back to recover an ethos of the Church more properly understood as pre-Vatican II, or of the Tridentine model, that is, that 400-year period after the Council of Trent right up to Vatican II, which was very much marked by opposition to Protestantism, a strong Catholic identity that marks itself out as being different from all other Christians and all other faiths. Ever since the council, there's been a clash of visions within Catholicism. There was upheaval after the council, and I would say, I would subscribe to the thesis that's been put forward by Father Ladislaw Orsi, a Jesuit whom some of you may know, a great canon lawyer and theologian. He says that the turbulence that we've experienced in the church is due to the divine energy that was stirred up by the Holy Spirit at the council, because as Catholics we believe that when the bishops gather all together in a solemn assembly, like a general council or an ecumenical council, that like the apostles in the upper room at Pentecost, the Holy Spirit is present and works on the deliberations there with a divine energy. And that energy moves. It needs a place to be channeled. And what happened after the council? We had nowhere to channel this energy. We needed structures to channel the energy. We talked about collegiality. The bishops talked about the active involvement of the laity. But it stopped there. These were nice exhortations. The only thing that the council actually pounded down was liturgy. That's the only thing that the Second Vatican Council actually changed structurally, was our Mass, the way we worshiped. Father Orsi believes, and I believe as well, that this energy, this kind of disruption, is divine energy that hasn't found a place, a proper structure. And until we find a proper structure, create a proper structure, this energy, this turbulence is going to continue in our church. We need new structures. Pope John Paul II did not believe this. The current Pope does not believe this. But there are signs of brewing problems everywhere. In the year or two before John Paul II died, I predicted that to my friends over bottled wine and food, anytime anybody would listen to me, I kept predicting there's going to be an implosion when this man dies. His personality is too big. It's overshadowed the church. We've got everything powerful on the outside, but on the inside things are crumbling, and we're not admitting it. Well, it's taken a while, but it's happening. And we see these dramatic things like the Vatican scandal as kind of big chunks that are falling in. But the implosion kind of continues on slowly. And until, I believe, we recognize the structural problems of the church, they're going to continue. Pope Benedict XVI has refused to entertain any discussions on these issues that I've talked about up till now. Instead, he's ignored the questions of structural reform. Actually, he's even said that such reforms are not needed. Instead, he insists that the only way out of the current crisis, which even he admits to, there is a crisis, is through interior conversion at the personal level of every individual. And I agree, that's important. Such conversion is necessary. But the current structures, as I've tried to argue, often mitigate against such a conversion. The Pope, for example, might exhort priests to listen to their people, to serve their people, rather than lord it over them. But there's no canonical law or mandate to force them to do so. Priest doesn't want to have a parish council, he doesn't have to. There's nothing in canon law that says he has to listen to his parishioners. That's a problem. And Pope Benedict XVI, as I said before, I kind of alluded that he's done things that I believe are hastening this implosion. And one of the things is his strong desire and the great attention that he's given to a group called the Society of St. Pius X, which were a group of 4 bishops currently that followed Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre after Vatican II in condemning much of the council. And they went into schism. The Pope lifted their excommunication. He renewed the old pre-Vatican II Mass and set up negotiations with them to help reestablish them in the heart of the church. It seems at times that the Pope gives all his attention to this side of the church, this very tiny side of the church, while ignoring the vast majority of people. Priest initiatives have sprung up in Austria, Germany, Switzerland, Ireland, England, even here in the United States. People want to be heard. They want dialogue. There's no dialogue in the church. This is a problem. And women, what do we say to women who want to be part of the church? You can come, but you can't be a part of the discussion on decision making. This makes no sense to young women today. We can't continue to keep women as a second in an inferior class in a world where we have women presidents and prime ministers, secretaries of state. It just doesn't make sense to young people today, I think. We also have another big problem. How do we deal with our Catholics who are in irregular marriage situations? The divorced and remarried cannot receive the sacraments. They make up half of our congregations in some places. If they're not allowed to participate, what about their children? This is a real problem. The Orthodox have found a way around it, but we don't seem to have found the way. A church that does not allow 99% of its members full participation in its decision-making structures in a democratic age, I'm convinced is going to shrink. Pope Benedict XVI and many of the bishops, even some of the faithful, may believe that a smaller, purer, more theologically orthodox and homogeneous church is a good thing. They and many other people point out that there is a general crisis of religious faith or a crisis of belief everywhere. They will say that all churches and religious communities are suffering decline because of secularism, consumerism, relativism, and so forth. And certainly that's true to an extent. But if the Catholic Church cannot find a way to hold on to and transmit its core beliefs, the credo beliefs, and still be relevant to people of today, and truly engage the concrete situations of their lives, then it will either become pie in the sky or a small society of the righteous. It will simply become a group of ideology or merely a religious form of public morality. But if that happens, it's going to cease to be a faith that is faith in Jesus of Nazareth and incarnate faith in the incarnate Son of God. Whether that happens, I believe, depends not only on the continuous conversion of every believer, but also the conversion, transformation, and change of the very structures of the church. Otherwise, the implosion will continue. Thank you.
We are honored today to welcome Robert Mickens, Vatican correspondent for The Tablet, a British Catholic weekly journal. We will return to our speaker momentarily for the traditional City Club questions. Please formulate your questions now and remember to be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here and those listening to 90.3 WCPN, IdeaStream, WCLV, WTAM, and one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS IdeaStream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Closed captioning for our programs is made possible by the Nordson Corporation. Today is the annual Sidney D. Josephs Endowed Forum, made possible by the generosity of the family of Sidney Josephs. We thank them for their support. Now we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphone today is City Club Program Director Carrie Miller. First question, please.
Mr. Mickens, in the great state of Ohio, Congress representatives and state representatives are elected from districts which have been redistricted to produce a certain result. Bishops are selected by the current hierarchy, and the bishops in turns are from where the cardinals and the Pope ultimately is selected. What mechanism do you see on the horizon that is likely to break that circle?
A good question. I think probably we have to look back because the Catholic Church is very much a church rooted in its tradition. We have a tradition in our church, and it exists in some parts of Europe today, where the cathedral chapter actually elects the bishop of a particular diocese. So the priests And it used to be even deacons and lay people of a particular place would elect from among their number. This goes back to the apostolic tradition. How we get back to that is a good question, because I don't know. It would take a pope with creativity and courage to re-implement this older tradition. Part of what happened at the Second Vatican Council, I think, is that certainly in our liturgical reform, we tried to go back to an earlier form of worship that had kind of developed or had been obscured with its development over the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And so I think I don't know if I've answered your question completely. Is that? I think that there is in our tradition the election of the bishops from the local clergy, and that happens even in a couple of dioceses in Europe to this day.
Mr. Mickens, excluding women from the clergy doesn't make sense to older women either, just so you know.
Especially.
Can you explain how American bishops, especially during this most recent political campaign, were so willing to slice and dice the long, strong Catholic tradition of Catholic social teaching to focus on the right to birth as opposed to the right to life, which one might think would include abolition of the death penalty, opposition to war, providing changes in social systems so that all, especially the most vulnerable, would have access to safety, education, and health care?
It's a perplexing question. I share your perplexity over that. I don't know. I mean, I cover the Vatican. There are strong American voices in the Roman Curia, most notably Cardinal Raymond Burke, who is extremely conservative, former Archbishop of St. Louis, who is now basically what you would call the head of the Vatican's equivalent of Supreme Court. And Cardinal Burke has been extremely outspoken on the issue of abortion. Of course, no one's in favor of abortion. That's not the issue here. But almost single-minded on abortion trumps all other parts of the Catholic social teaching. But I share the perplexity. I think that the Catholic people have shown that they do as well, in the sense that more than half of them, according to the survey, did not follow the bishop's recommendations at the last election.
Mr. Mickens, in speaking about the Catholic Church and its structure, you mentioned the method in which so much of it comes down uniformly, but aren't there within the Catholic Church some very strong factions that differ? And I'm thinking about the Jesuits, and what role do the Jesuits play, and can they be an effective factor in trying to prevent this implosion which you say is coming? Because as my understanding is, they do represent areas of thought that differ from that is conventional Catholicism.
Thank you. Yes, I think you're absolutely correct that despite the hierarchy, the Church survives in one sense. The Jesuits don't generally are not generally members of the hierarchy, the religious order. There are Jesuit bishops, of course, and even a couple of Jesuit cardinals. We lost a real good one recently when Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini, of late Archbishop of Milan, died. And his was certainly a voice, kind of a prophetic voice, a wake-up call to the Church that Cardinal Martini said the Church is 200 years behind the times on some of the issues that are core issues to people today. Certainly the men and women who are working with our people in the areas of health care, feeding and working with helping the poor, in our education system, which is still so vital, lay people, these Catholics, my brothers and sisters in the Catholic Church, we are the Catholic Church, and we continue to do the best we can. It's sometimes very discouraging when bishops at least more recently, have become so heavy-handed on the pelvic issues, as they call them, or so on abortion, on women's issues, on even women's ordination. Recently, I just saw, you might have seen this as well on your Yahoo page on your computer, that a bishop or a priest in Minnesota refused to allow a 17-year-old youngster to be confirmed because on his Facebook page he had a support same-sex marriage poster. He posed with that on his Facebook page. Now, if we're going to start doing that, we're going to really clear out the barn quickly, I'm afraid. So there is, there's a. On the other hand, you know, what does it mean to be Catholic? Is Catholicism about same-sex marriage or being gay or straight, or is it more fundamentally about the belief in the incarnation, the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God? I mean, and once we focus on those issues, on that main issue, the kerygma, the main kernel of faith, then these other issues flow. But a lot of the things, I'm afraid, that we get caught up in are second, even third order on church teaching. The main proclamation of the gospel is not about marriage. I mean, what kind of marriage are we talking about? Was Jesus, in Jesus' time, I think there were probably a lot of arranged marriages. There was polygamy. And we present the modern American middle-class family in the suburbs as the family that was designed by God from all eternity and always was the one that was promoted. And that's just not true.
Thank you. Bob, I wonder if you, I have really a two-part question. One is, would you be able to comment on what impact, if any, but I hopefully so, the international movement for reform and renewal in the church has been working toward for the last 20 to 25 years? I think of International Movement for We Are Church, and certainly in the United States, my own organization, Future Church, Call to Action, Voice of the Faithful. What impact that has on all this evolving thing in the structures of the church. And the second one, do you see any change happening with the next conclave?
I knew that question was coming. It's the one thing that we always get, those of us who do this kind of odd job of being Vaticanists or Vaticanologists. That's the first thing everybody wants to know. I'm surprised that it came like the fourth question. I'll get to that in a minute. The reform movements. The reform movements, for a long time, were engaged by and listened to and sometimes upbraided by the hierarchy, the bishops. More recently, under Pope Benedict XVI, I think I've detected kind of a strategy of, I call it this, reward is like a pedagogy of a teacher. A teacher goes into a classroom and I'm just going to give all my attention to the good kids. The kids I don't like or don't do what I like, I'm just going to ignore them. The hope is that those bad apples will eventually fall into line, or they'll, unfortunately, leave the class. If they continue to disrupt the class, then and only then will we have to take a step to discipline them. And I think that's what Pope Benedict XVI has done in his travels and in a lot of his teaching in this pontificate. He's given a lot of attention to more conservative elements and groups in the church, and just basically ignored the groups that continue to call. There's no entertaining of a discussion, no admission of a discussion. Given a good example, Cardinal Claudio Humas was Franciscan, was Archbishop in Brazil, was named as head of the Vatican office for the clergy. And before he left Sao Paulo, before he got on the plane, he gave an interview to some journalists, O Globo newspaper, and he said, well, sure, we could have married priests. There's nothing against married priests. It's in our tradition, first 1,000 years. In the Western tradition, we had married priests, and even today in the Eastern churches, we have married priests. It's not a problem. That's something we can discuss. he arrived in Rome, and he was greeted there by Vatican officials, gave him a piece of paper, and he disavowed everything he had said just 15 hours earlier. And that seems to be the policy. We're not going to entertain these questions. We just ignore these groups. If they make too much noise, and one of the groups that is right now is this priest initiative. When it becomes the priest, they have to start listening, because in Vienna you've got a problem. About 500 priests in Austria who began this priest initiative about 2 years ago, and they've gone to, first they were ignored, and then they issued a call to disobedience. Oh boy, they didn't like that in Rome, and Cardinal Schönborn didn't like that, and so then we have to start talking to them, get them back on board. The priests aren't budging, the cardinal's not budging. The cardinal can't just say, fine, I'm going to fire all of you. He can't do that. So they're in a bit of a pickle right now, and it's this priest initiative is moving to other countries. It's in Switzerland, it's in Germany, there's small groups, big group in Ireland. In the United States, there's a fledgling group that's begun this past summer, I think. And I think the priests will be, in a sense, the ones that, they're usually the older priests, because the younger priests, it's a kind of a different breed, most of them, more traditional, more obedient. But the older priests, who are men who came out of the Second Vatican Council with a vision and a fire and a love for their people and their church, these are the priests who have said for many years, we need to have a discussion, and they've been ignored. It's become critical, beyond critical, and they're speaking up. They may finally get some attention. The second question is about any hope at the conclave. Well, you know, when I said before, when the bishops gather together in an assembly, like a council, we believe that the Holy Spirit is there. And we believe that when the cardinals gather together to elect a new pope, that the Holy Spirit is present at the conclave as well. Pope Benedict XVI says, history will show that he's not always, or she's not always present, however. If I ever had a direct question could put to the Pope, I'd ask him if he thought the Holy Spirit were present when he was elected. But he's admitted that it's clear that it hasn't always been present. But the question of, I guess your question, Chris, is do we see the great white hope or the great black hope on the horizon? And I don't know. It's hard to say, because right now the cardinals tend never to say anything bad about the Pope. And if you work in the Vatican, as I did for a decade or so, the one thing you learn, it's never the Pope's fault. I mean, things can get really bad. It's the Pope's horse or his mistress or somebody else. The butler did it. You see, so it's never the Pope, and so the cardinals, even more so, would never publicly show themselves to be, certainly not this generation of bishops or cardinals, would not show themselves to be in any way out of sync with the Bishop of Rome. I think after the Second Vatican Council, immediately after the council, since there had been such a lively debate in the Basilica during the council among the bishops, and since one of their own actually became Pope in the midst of the council, Paul VI, I think immediately after the council you saw bishops like Cardinal Sunens, and many of you will have known probably because he came here to Cleveland, I think, a lot, and other cardinals who were strong, Cardinal Koenig. They were not afraid to challenge the Pope. Humani Vitae is a classic example. Many bishops came out and said, I think they love the Holy Father, but I think he's wrong on this, and they don't do that today. You don't hear a lot of that. So it's hard to identify kind of somebody who will break, but I will say, as this crisis continues to worsen, and the bishops are feeling it, there's a crisis of authority. They're going to be looking for somebody that can heal the wounds. I have a man in mind. He's a Brazilian. He's currently the head of the Congregation for Religious. His name is Cardinal João Braz de Vise. I don't want to jinx him, but I think that he'd be a good bet for somebody who's moderate. Probably they're all pretty conservative, but it's a kind of a conservative organization, the College of Cardinals. So, but he's a good one. He's very much influenced and connected to the Focolare movement. If you know the Focolare movement, one of their big charisms is building unity, dialogue, not just among Christians, but with other faiths as well. So Cardinal Braz could be a dark horse that emerges. Otherwise, there are the usual suspects that you hear in the media. Cardinal Scola in Milan seems to be the one that the Italians want, and their Cardinal Ouellet, Canadian, is another one who's a compromise candidate, perhaps.
Let me say first that I'm Episcopal, and I'm interested in what happens in the Catholic Church. I'm not criticizing it. My first comment is I don't understand when there was the argument about Obama for requiring the various birth problems in the Catholic Church, why they didn't tear a page out of the ACLU and go for separation of state and church, which would take even synagogues in, which have their problems. Second comment that I had was that last summer, 30 graduates and donors to Harvard Divinity School had about 4 hours for the dinner with the retiring dean. And the interesting comment was that the biggest single element in the Harvard Divinity School is Catholic women looking for a formal seminary. And they're looking for what they can do when they come out. They can become hospital people that help the bereaved and things of that nature. But if you want to find some really solid Catholic women who've had a seminary, go to Harvard Divinity.
Thank you. I agree. One of the things, if I could just make a comment on the bereavement, I think I just attended a funeral of a family member, and we had a deacon that came over on the vigil at the funeral home and led a prayer service. And I thought to myself, you know, we're in a year of faith right now in the Catholic Church, and the Pope has launched a new evangelization. He's even formed a new office, a pontifical council, to promote a new evangelization. And I thought to myself, if there's one place that we can really touch people, and we need to touch people, and we need to give our best efforts, it's at funerals. Because we have people that come back to church for the first time since the last funeral, probably, and they sent over a deacon. God love him. He's from Fort Worth, Texas or something, could not speak English to save his life, could not read. It was embarrassing. I was embarrassed for him. I was embarrassed for the members of my family that were at this funeral, a very tragic funeral. It was not comforting at all. It was a great irritation, and there's a case where I wish they'd not sent anybody or sent a woman who could read or anybody, but because he's been ordained a deacon, he can do it, and the other people, maybe there's an expectation that it had to be an ordained man to do this. But certainly, I make an appeal to anybody out there who's involved in bereavement ministry, give your best efforts, because that's the place of the new evangelization. It's at least one opening.
My question was to deal with nuns on the bus. In America, every one of us have had somebody who's been a member of our family, some loved one we cherish as our teacher, and we know that the American bishops seem to be doing something negative to nuns on the bus. But I really want to get back to your other question. Some of the literature seems to think that the Pope believes that his former Pope spoke ex cathedra, dealing with the issue of silencing anyone who wants female priests. Thank you.
No, you're right, and that's been contested by a number of people. There are theologians that question that as well. Unfortunately, it's hard to even question the infallibility if you're not even allowed to talk about it. So,
it's nice having such a vivid portrayal of political issues, candidly, within a spiritual enterprise. And I have a simple question set in a somewhat complex setting. There's a concept called subsidiarity, which actually has its origins, I think, in a papal encyclical, and has become very important in Europe, where the European Union has tried to decide where do you lodge power. And it's a very constructive debate within the European Union. And I wonder if that very concept of subsidiarity, which has roots within the Church, will be a vehicle for talking about these tough questions of where do you lodge power, actually talking about power, which is always a strain for a spiritual enterprise. It's the battle of the temporal in the spiritual. So Do you think that's perhaps an opening for addressing some of your concerns?
Again, it's something that's part of our tradition, and so there's no reason to invent new vehicles or new channels. It's to draw on the ones that we already have. They're in documents. They are there. I think one of the things is that there's the Catholic Church is too often, I think, certainly at the level of the Vatican, crippled by fear. People are afraid to raise their voice, and in this very kind of strange, anachronistic structure that's built on who you know. As the one gentleman said, bishops are appointed by other bishops. It's kind of a club. We just kind of self-perpetuate ourselves. Has anybody here ever received a questionnaire about candidates to the episcopacy? I suppose maybe it happens. I mean, but yeah, the subsidiarity thing, I think that's a good place to start. And I would just say again that it's all within our tradition, but sometimes we get too far away from it. We need to go back to it. I'm a traditionalist, actually.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to a Friday forum featuring Robert C. Mickens, Vatican correspondent for the tablet. Thank you, Mr. Mickens. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.